And so today is our program for the week of May 5th, 2025. Samara, it's great to see you again. Last week we talked a little bit about the court cases that we're moving through the various federal courts regarding Palestinian activists in support of Palestine who have been detained by the federal government. I believe Rumeisa Ozturk's case was being held this morning, and she was Zooming in or video conferencing in from Louisiana. And so we're still awaiting her transfer to Vermont. You and I talked a little bit before we started about some of the shenanigans going on with Mike Huckabee, and you had warned us a while back about the to keep an eye on Huckabee's selection as the U.S. ambassador to Israel, and now it looks like he is moving some pieces with regarding to aid in Gaza. And then, of course, there's just the sort of ongoing news about ongoing attacks by Israel in Gaza and the West Bank. And so, again, a lot to cover, but how are you doing, my friend? And what do you think will be, what are you going to be covering for us today? Just a small little bit sliver of it.
I feel like, every week I sort of make a comment about like, I always say like, oh, what a week, because like it always feels like a week, but then this particular week feels like a lot. But my God, this week felt like a lot.
Yeah.
I can't be the only one that, yeah, just the overwhelming tidal wave of information and developments that have happened in Palestine, in Yemen, and here in the US is just like, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. Once again on
Funny
the
because
road.
your job is to help us feel less overwhelmed.
I know, I'm failing. I'm so sorry.
No, no.
But yeah, hopefully I can at least share whatever piece of it I've been able to sort of disentangle, which is definitely not all of it. Um,
Well, I appreciate you, and I'll leave you to it.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, always great to be here. And jumping straight in because, yeah, what a week. As always, what a week. Um, it was a particularly brutal week in Gaza, as I'm sure a lot of folks know. The bombing campaigns that have really ticked up since the ceasefire, was pulled out, like Israel pulled out of the ceasefire agreement in March. We're now at a point of, um, the death toll easily surpassing 100 people per day again, which is more or less what it was in the worst phases of the previous kind of, escalated genocidal attack. A single, we're seeing some days in which several hundred people are being killed. So just absolute carnage and unfettered aggression that, is at this point really being talked about very openly without Israel sort of like, couching what it's doing. It's clearly just targeting and killing large numbers of civilians. In the context of that, we're still in this situation of a total aid collapse. Last week on the PSAs, we talked about the World Food Program running out of its remaining stocks of food. So like whatever remaining supplies were still there are now fully distributed, and nothing new has come in. So since Israel blocked all humanitarian aid 2 weeks before the ceasefire agreement came into effect, to this day, still nothing has really come in meaningfully. So we are seeing a situation where starvation, death by starvation, is becoming a fact of life again. Right? This is something that we were seeing right before the last ceasefire was signed, and so we're back to sort of the worst possible levels. It's a sign, I suppose, that the New York Times and DW and other outfits are describing it in its full horror, which is something that they have historically really failed to do, but a really meaningful development there. The DW describing the reality in Gaza as indescribable in terms of how horrible these aid cutoffs are, and I think that's if anything an understatement. In the context of that is of course this sort of active attempt by the Israeli military to just continue to undermine the social fabric of Gaza in whatever possible way they can. So we've talked many times on the PSAs, for those of you who have been attending for a while now, about the the justification that Israel has historically given about aid being looted, and the reason they can't provide more aid is because it keeps getting looted by people, and then investigations that have previously uncovered ways in which the IDF was arming looters and shooting security services that were trying to stop the looters. And sure enough, right, during that ceasefire period or the cessation of hostilities that we were in January and February, when Israel pulled its troops out, all of the loot, the so-called looting, magically vanished, right? Because the security services in Gaza were able to operate without being attacked by the Israeli military. And we're now seeing that again. There's this really great piece in Mondoweiss this week getting into how Israel is purposely creating the sort of power vacuum and doing it partly by backing armed looters. And then it's even worse this time around because before, looters were largely hitting like international aid distributions, which now don't even exist anymore. So this is really sort of, I think, intended to create the sort of social chaos in the sense that no sense of stability anywhere. And that's alongside, Israel's own campaign of annihilation. So that's, the last remaining restaurant that was still operating in Gaza City was destroyed this week in a really horrific bombing. Dropsite covers it in gruesome detail, but I think an important read for folks who want to get a sense of how those campaigns are operating. And so in the shadow of all of that is this new aid plan. The two new things came out this week that are related but different. One is the new Israeli plan for occupying Gaza, and the other is this aid plan. It's something called the Gaza Aid Foundation, something that's been set up in Switzerland, I think. So we'll talk about both, of course, but we're going to start with the aid plan, which builds on what we were talking about last week, where there had been some talk about using Rafah, the area that the Israelis have now cut off from the rest of Gaza with the new Morag corridor, and are like flattening, using bulldozers and things basically to level it all out. We heard that there would be, plans to use it as a new humanitarian aid distribution point, and that does seem to be moving forward. So this new so-called aid plan is basically allowing 60 trucks per day back into Gaza. And, for folks who have been watching this for a while, you have a sense of how unimaginably insufficient 60 trucks is. Again, you're dealing with just shy of 2 million people. And, with some vague idea that conceivably it could go up at some point in the future. And those 60 trucks are being sent only to Rafah, where they were going to be sent to, I believe, 4, if I'm remembering correctly, somewhere between 4 and 6 distribution points, each of which is specifically tied to, I think, 5,000 or 6,000 families in Gaza. And again, just, do the math there, right? Like you're talking about 20,000 families or so, which is nowhere near, like not, a drop in the bucket, basically, in terms of what's needed to sustain life in Gaza. But even that tiny sliver of aid that's being provided and coordinated through this plan is like so unimaginably bureaucratically entangled into the security state apparatus that it's also in its own weird way effectively useless. Like those aid points, because they're tied to specific families, they've developed this whole system of using facial recognition and some other like high-tech mumbo jumbo to figure out who they're distributing the aid to make sure that it's going to specific individuals. And all of this is going to be carried out by the U.S. contractors, basically mercenaries, who will be on the ground implementing this sort of, really draconian and totally outside of the way that any aid is normally distributed, cutting out entirely the United Nations, international humanitarian organizations, the coordination bodies that figure out how to do aid effectively, the like monitoring and investigation people that figure out like what aid is needed, where and when, like all of that is gone. And in its place is the Israeli security state and US mercenaries collaborating using weird new high-tech tools to try to distribute aid to like 1% of Gazans. It's really hard to overstate what an absolute joke this aid plan is. and it's being widely derided as basically impossible to really meaningfully implement. So what actually happens with it is, I think, something we're gonna, have to see in the next few days. It's been roundly condemned by European countries and, of course, the UN and all the aid agencies, but the US is pushing it very hard, unsurprisingly. Mike Huckabee is like, one of the big people behind it, and it's of course a big financial boon for these private military contractors that are making so much money off of things like this anyway. So not super surprising that the U.S. state apparatus is fully behind this plan, despite the fact that it's not even going to remotely do the thing that it ostensibly is supposed to be doing. So I think we're in a bit of a wait and see here, whether that'll actually be implemented and what it'll look like if it is implemented, and whether it's really possible for it to be effective in any meaningful way. But it's, as with like the last big U.S. aid push, which was the PEER, if folks remember that boondoggle. It's more for PR, I think, than anything meaningfully about resolving the underlying humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And of course, alongside this aid plan is the new new plan recently approved by the Israeli Security Cabinet for sure, and I think the entire cabinet, for an escalation in Gaza. And if, like me, when you first heard that, you thought, like, what could an escalation possibly be beyond what this is already looking like? I am very sorry to report that it is, in many ways, a really meaningful, both qualitative and quantitative escalation in what Israel is trying to do in Gaza. So there's a few different pieces of this. One is the occupation, in Israel's words here, like the occupation and conquering of all the territory in Gaza. So right now, the Israeli army basically operates from a very limited number of places, and then it goes into all of its no-go zones, does whatever it wants to do, and then pulls back. And the new plan would be just basically permanent occupation. So troops will maintain a presence in all of these areas. And in so doing, force the entire population of Gaza into Rafah. And so we talked last week, and we were like, okay, there's some talk about relocating people away from El Mawasi to Rafah. There's some talk of it being a humanitarian zone. So we'll see what actually pans out. It's both. Apparently, it's both. And so basically, they're going to push every single person that they can into this tiny area that they've completely demolished, and then maintain full military control over all of it indefinitely, with no real plan for how to change it or how to get out of it, or what happens from here. And there's some sense of like this is sort of tied to Trump's visit to the region, which is happening this week. But we'll come back to the way that it's related to the Trump stuff. But just to say that like this actually is in many ways a really terrifying escalation. And a key piece of this is that Israel is drawing up its reserves. So all the reserve forces that were on standby, they're calling them up for duty. Not to send them to Gaza, incidentally, because they're not capable of doing that, but to replace the troops that are currently in the West Bank so they can free up the troops in the West Bank to go to Gaza. But the recruitment drive itself, or not recruitment, but the like calling up the reserves, whatever verb exists for that, is also this really precarious thing where they're very selectively calling up the reserves because they know that the majority of reservists won't show up and will refuse to serve. And so like they're in this really weird situation where they're trying to call up people, but they don't have sufficient numbers to do it effectively. So unclear where that's going to go, but like once again, just shows the stacked level of just sort of completely failed strategic and ideological orientations that underline this entire genocidal project. The rhetoric that has been coming out from this plan of conquering Gaza is just really horrifying. You're seeing the usual suspects in the Israeli cabinet talking about the total destruction of the Gaza Strip, and literally saying concentration camps, like just the brain-breaking irony of a state born out of the Holocaust, like gleefully talking about sending people to concentration camps. Um, and alongside all of that, if like the whole like U.S. security contractor thing for the aid distribution wasn't bad enough, the other piece of this is apparently that there is some talk. This isn't part of the plan that was officially approved, as far as I understand it. It's still like a sort of thing that's being discussed. But there is talk of handing over Gaza to U.S. administration in a manner, and described by the U.S. government this way, by the way, in a manner reminiscent of the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq, that famously successful U.S. colonial government that managed Iraq for a decade, which is an absolute abysmal failure in every possible way. So recreating some sort of governance structure like that, where the U.S. would be occupying Gaza and running it in a sort of colonial government style. That's early days, and I don't know whether much will come from that. And there's a lot of pushback on that in ways that we'll come back to, but did want to flag it as another layer of the wildness of this week. In a way that folks are probably used to at this point, if you've been coming to the PSAs regularly, the Israeli media tends to be much more forthright about what's actually going on here than we get in traditional U.S. media. So, this Times of Israel article acknowledges that this plan is described as one that's almost guaranteed to lose the remaining Israeli hostages, because that sort of like high-level military campaign is just going to kill more people and make it basically impossible for any sort of hostage release. And this editorial in Haaretz, I feel like, did a pretty good job of kind of going through why this entire plan is a disaster fueled by delusion, and just basically incapable of doing anything that would, actually meaningfully achieve any of Israel's strategic objectives, right? Including, of course, degrading Hamas or getting the hostages out. But even this like ethnic cleansing of Palestine is like not a thing that, this idea of forcing Palestinians into a situation where they would accept voluntary resettlement is also this sort of like failed on its basis idea that doesn't really have any grounding, and like no one's willing to take them. So, and like in the context of that, we're actually seeing some new information coming out again in Israeli media about the real ambitions of this war. There's a document that the IDF put out that lists the priorities of Israel's genocidal actions in Gaza in order of priority, and returning the hostages was number 6 on a list of 6. So like, just goes to show, like, for all the talk of, what about the hostages? We need to bring the hostages home. Like, that's just always been nonsense. And if it wasn't enough to see that, to prove that point, we heard from Netanyahu. This is a slightly older article. It's not this week. It was back in April, but I did think it was important just to cross-reference this idea that, Netanyahu's spokesperson saying explicitly, we don't want to get all the hostages back at once, because if we got all the hostages back at once, bringing back everyone will bring back Hamas. So like, we're not willing to do anything that would undermine our like long-term political vision for how Gaza wants to be. So if anyone ever says anything to you about, what about the hostages, please refer to them to one of these 2 articles. In the context of all this is, of course, the ephemeral ceasefire that's always around the corner. And sure enough, again, this week, we're seeing some talk about the ceasefire, but nothing that has meaningfully moved in any real direction. Last week we talked about how the parties are so diametrically opposed in what their stated ambitions and intentions are that it doesn't seem realistic that they'd find any common ground. And we're now at a point where I think Hamas is saying very publicly, like, there's no point talking about the ceasefire anymore, particularly given, Bassem Naim called it a hunger war and a war of extermination. Like, what are we doing trying to negotiate with these people who are clearly not interested in negotiating? And a different senior Hamas official did an interview with Dropsite that I think provides a really interesting understanding of like what Hamas has been proposing over these last couple of months. And I pasted this very long paragraph here that you can read. on your own time when you get the slides, but basically, just going into like all the different options that have been on the table. Like, okay, go back to the agreement from January 17th. Let's stick to the thing that we signed. No, okay, let's do like a full one and done, exchange all the hostages for a temporary, for like a temporary 5-year ceasefire. And then like, a series of other options and just Israel saying no to any of them, like just absolutely not, like the no willingness to move on any of these possibilities. So with Gaza, just I don't know, just horrifyingly sad in its current orientation. The situation in the West Bank also, of course, ramping up in really horrific ways. Not different than what we usually discuss here. So the largest demolition yet in Masafariata took place this week. Just a giant like bulldozing and displacement of remaining population there, while at the same time that Mike Huckabee, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, and like millenarian like begging for end times kind of evangelical Christian is visiting illegal settlements in the West Bank and meeting with like the settlement organizations and settlement advocates in ways that like that's literally basically the first thing that he did as the ambassador to Israel. So just to give you a sense of where his orientation is. But the other big news this week, of course, was the developments in Yemen. A lot, like, I don't know, 3 giant things happened in Yemen this week that are all really important. One, Donald Trump announced, even though he wasn't supposed to, in his typical sort of loudmouthed way, he preempted the official announcement of a new, I don't know if ceasefire is the right word for what happened here, but basically Trump announced, and then Oman, who had been conducting the negotiations, announced the following day that the U.S. had agreed to stop bombing Yemen if Yemen agreed to stop bombing U.S. ships. And no one has actually, well, no one I know, or nothing I've read, has had the actual text of the agreement in it. So it's not really clear to anybody what actually has fully been agreed to. We know some things, but there's a lot that we don't know. And, it's clear that the U.S. bombing of Yemen is stopping. It's clear that the Houthis have promised to stop bombing U.S. warships. It's not 100% clear whether or not they've agreed to stop bombing commercial ships that are affiliated with the United States or not. I suspect that they will also stop bombing those, but it's not super clear. It's even less clear. Well, actually, it's rather clear, I think, that Yemen is going to continue to attack any ships that are conducting trade with Israel that are trying to go to the Israeli port. And they've said as much. So the Houthis have like announced, like, we're going to continue to attack any ships that are doing business with Israel. And perhaps most surprisingly of all, the agreement does not include any restrictions on the Houthis continuing to attack Israel. And the Houthis, after announcing the agreement, again explicitly said, we are going to continue to shoot rockets at Israel. And Trump was asked about this, and he said, like, and they're like, the deal doesn't include Yemen stopping its attacks on Israel. Is that okay? And he basically was like, yeah, that's not, that wasn't part of what we agreed. It's like, it's a deal we're making between Yemen and the United States. Israel has nothing to do with it, which shocking, right? Like, again, this is the sort of Trump wildcard thing where the range of possibility is so much wider than it was under Biden. So you're getting worse things for sure, but also like it would have been inconceivable for Biden to sign a deal with the Houthis. And remember, Biden was the one who started this bombing campaign in Yemen that didn't include something about stopping attacks on Israel. And just to say, like, the U.S. has spent an unimaginable amount of money bombing Yemen, like probably an order of magnitude more than Yemen has spent in this entire enterprise. And just this week, a F-16 or one of these fighter jets plunged into the sea when the aircraft carrier had to like evade some missiles. every time the Yemenis shoot down a drone, that's like, I don't know, tens of millions of dollars. So I think the U.S. was keen to get out of a situation where they weren't really accomplishing anything. They haven't really degraded the Houthis' military capabilities. Certainly no more than, say, 7 years of Saudi bombings did, right? Like we're at the point where this sort of performative military bombardment doesn't really do anything. And at the same time, we're seeing, for the first time, one of the missiles launched by the Houthis actually hit Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv, which was, an escalation that, like, the missiles had been fired regularly, but this is the first one, I think, that really made it that far and hit. And of course, the response by the Israeli military was just absolute fury. They bombed and destroyed the entire Sana'a, like the main airport in Yemen, the civilian airport, and again bombed the dockyards at Hodeidah. But like, again, this sort of it's significant escalation in the Israeli attacks on Yemen, but it doesn't really do anything to stop the Houthis from being able to send these missiles, right? And they have thousands of them. And the stated goal by the Yemeni military after that missile hit was, we hope this is like a message to international airlines that they don't fly into Tel Aviv anymore because it's not safe. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened, right? All these airlines suspended flights to Tel Aviv. So just to, like, once again underscore the idea that you really, as Western powers, like, you cannot bomb your way to victory into these things. Like, that's just not the way these things play out. And, for all of the carnage wrought by the United States and Israel bombing the Houthis are probably stronger now than they've ever been, right? And now they're, making these proclamations saying that, like, our military stood up against the biggest military on earth and we won, right? So, like, they've built more political legitimacy through this process than they've lost. And just like, yeah, just, again, a reminder of that, this, like, winning through indiscriminate violence just doesn't work. It doesn't get you to the place that, these people keep trying over and over again to do and continually fail to do. Just to really quickly touch on Lebanon and Syria, just to note a new giant round of airstrikes in Lebanon this week by the Israeli Air Force, and a renewed push by the United States and the Gulf to force the Lebanese military to disarm Hezbollah, which not a thing, but they're going to try, maybe. And in Syria, a renewed round of Israeli airstrikes in Syria as well. But the bigger news, and something that we've actually known for a few weeks now, and I think we talked about it on the PSAs, although it might have been one of the weeks that we had taken off, that the Emirates had been coordinating secret meetings between the new Syrian government and the Israeli government. And those meetings are escalating and now have been acknowledged by the Syrian government, saying, yes, we're talking to Israel. And the Emirates are facilitating those meetings. And we knew that, like, weeks ago, people were tracking the flight histories of, like, Israeli foreign ministry planes and the new Syrian government planes, and they both went to the Dubai at the same time. So we knew this was happening, but obviously a really worrying development, particularly given that, Israel continues to occupy a giant chunk of southern Syria and is setting up more forward operating bases, and now has set up this week a hospital or like a medical center inside Syria, ostensibly to protect the Druze that are being attacked in sectarian violence in Syria that they are themselves fomenting. But yeah, just worrying developments all around there. And then the other big news this week is, of course, the stuff that's been happening with Iran, where the framework for a new nuclear deal seems to be coming together, in a very preliminary stages. But in those preliminary stages, hilariously, it seems to be more or less the exact same deal that Obama signed with Iran, that Trump ripped up in his first term. And, that's not super surprising, right? He was never really against the deal. He was just against Obama. And so, like, if it's got his name on it, he's going to be very happy with it. But the fact that we're getting to a deal at all is a really important development, given that there are a lot of people involved in the Trump administration who are very keen for there not to be a deal, and in fact, like to use this as a pretext just to go to war with Iran. And it does seem, actually, maybe surprisingly, that that's not what Trump seems to want in this moment. Like, he's actually more keen for a deal than a new war. And one of the reasons it seems that Mike Waltz, the former national security advisor, what's his role? Who's now the UN ambassador, the ambassador of the UN. One of the reasons he was kicked out of that role, in addition to the, signal fiasco about the Yemen strikes, is that he had apparently been doing back channel conversations with the Israelis about making sure that the Iran process would result in war. And Trump really, really didn't like that, apparently. He was more upset about that than he was about the signal leaks. So again, this like wild card Trump thing tells us something about the possible range in which things can take place. And, frankly, and we talked about this, even last year, that, not to give him any credit, the man is a racist, fascist, whatever, and he is more susceptible to public opinion than Joe Biden ever was, right? Like the Democrats are so walled off from what anyone thinks about anything. But a sizable part of the MAGA movement, for all of its racist horrors and all of its like whatever isolationism, also means that they have no interest in propping up the Israeli military or starting new foreign wars. And there's it was some of the strangest 10 minutes of my week was listening to Marjorie Taylor Greene on the Young Turks do an interview, and I mean, she sounded bonkers. Like, don't get me wrong, she's just totally off the wall. But the things that she was saying, while saying them very poorly or whatever, were like, we shouldn't be giving U.S. aid to Israel. We shouldn't be getting involved in a war with Iran. We shouldn't have been bombing the Houthis. She went into this whole thing about like, I've never met a Houthi. I don't even know what Houthis look like. Like, Houthis have no impact on like my constituents in Georgia, which like, yeah, that's actually true. Stop clock, right? Like every now and again might say the right thing. But like, I think it speaks to that, that aspect of the MAGA movement that is very like isolationist, right? And is not, that is keen on cutting off all of these other countries and not, invading and occupying them. And so, I think we're seeing some of that inflected in Trump's foreign policy. And it's weird because we have to balance that at the same time with obviously what he's doing domestically in terms of like, deporting students for anti-Semitism, so-called anti-Semitism and stuff. But like, we can see those as sort of the same thing, right? It's still isolationism. But we are seeing a number of articles this week talking about the deterioration of relations between Trump and Netanyahu. Around the Iran deal specifically, but also as it relates to what's happening in Gaza, and Trump again pushing some sort of ceasefire in Gaza, not because he cares about Palestinians, but because he's currently traveling to the Middle East this week to meet not with Israel. He's not going to Israel, incredibly. He's only going to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Emirates, which money, right? Like he's going for money and investment, and it's going to be easier for him to do that if the genocide isn't like in its deepest, whatever, highest levels. So his attempts for that ceasefire are being rebuffed, and I think it is souring relationships in ways that have material implications, I think, for how things are going to look going forward. Domestically, meanwhile, the ADL, never one to refrain from stooping to new lows, is now accusing like any attempt to monitor or put contingencies on U.S. arms sales to Israel as anti-Semitism. So apparently it's anti-Semitic to not send bombs to Israel. And this, yeah, it's a wild article in Responsible Statecraft, and I definitely recommend giving it a read. But the one that strikes a little more close to home, and one that we really need to think about in terms of our response to it, is a really big push by Zionist organizations in California and in the Bay Area to kill ethnic studies in California. There was a giant lobby day just this week by JPAC, the Jewish Public Affairs Committee, that sent 600 people to Sacramento with the number one goal on their like list of basically killing ethnic studies. And so defending ethnic studies is actually a really critical part of the overall, like, and our like liberatory vision for all of our communities. And so there are calls to action here. I think CARE and a few other organizations are really leading the way in making sure that people are reaching out to their about protecting ethnic studies. The last
I just want to
attempt.
interrupt you for a second. I don't know if it's your microphone is kind of kicking in and out because of the
Yeah,
yeah.
let me see if I can. Yeah,
No,
thanks for
it's
that.
fine now. I think it's
Yeah.
just you I think you knocked it. That's all.
Ah, got it. Thank you. So yeah, just to say that like their attempts at passing some of these bills are hitting some really serious opposition. And so this is a really critical moment, I think, for folks to engage and make sure that ethnic studies is protected and, teachers and students are protected. Um, and I think, try to find some resources on like petitions and things that y'all should sign. Maybe send them out in the email. Uh, Also, just some updates on like the like campus repression stuff and some of the BDS victories. We saw this week that uh, it turned out that the UCLA police shot students with rubber bullets, which is illegal. So now the students are suing the university, which dope. And for folks who were involved with the Alameda County divestment vote, which happened a few months ago, which was a really big deal and took a ton of organizing. The Alameda County Treasury Oversight Committee voted this week to like actually do meaningful divestment from companies that are supporting the Israeli occupation. A huge deal and a really big step forward. So definitely worthwhile to send a thank you to those committee members. I think I put a link for the DSA form to send a thank you to those committee members for doing the right thing and standing on the side of, people and not genocide. So definitely worth taking a moment to send those emails. Just a couple other like BDS things to note. One, made me very happy to see all these Radiohead concerts in the UK were canceled because of BDS pressure, because Radiohead has been absolutely horrible about the Palestine stuff for decades now. And one of the Radiohead drummer, I think, is on tour with some Israeli singer, and they're just getting shut down everywhere they go. And the big anti-BDS bill that was going to be put forward in Congress this week was sunk, which would have put like really serious criminal penalties on boycotting Israel. You can boycott the US, you can boycott any other country, but apparently if you boycott Israel, you face like prison time and fines. But that also, again, in this like really strange bedfellows way, was opposed by the right in a way that allowed it to be sunk, in a combination of pressure for like the left of Democrats who are like, there is such a thing called freedom of speech, and the right that also I think is, for their own kind of awful reasons probably, who like genuinely probably want the right to be anti-Semitic. But regardless, that bill is dead, and that is a huge step. And then lastly, just like reflecting on the shifting tides of public opinion here. This BBC article this week about how the sort of bipartisan consensus or like the special relationship with Israel is now dead. It's just like straight up dead. But this article is particularly interesting because it gets into how the Democratic establishment has failed to kind of catch up with the changing public opinion, and how like longtime Democratic operatives are like, yeah, like our constituencies are pretty pro-Palestine now, but all the prominent Democrats that are currently at the, considered for top of the ticket runs in 2028 have the sort of, she calls it classically supportive of Israel, which like, yeah. So it's just a fascinating way, again, in which like the political class is just so out of touch with what's happening in terms of changing public opinions here. So to sum everything up, this new plan for conquering Gaza is really quite a significant escalation. It's really hard to overstate the amount of suffering and harm it's going to cause without really achieving anything. And it's being done in coordination with an aid plan that won't work. So pressure on both of those things is really critical in this moment, just absolutely critical to do what we can to stop either of those things from being put in place. Meanwhile, I think the dynamics in Yemen really demonstrate how a convergence of forces can sometimes really stall out the US war machine in fascinating ways. And looking at local public opinion, just thinking about the ways in which the U.S.-Israel special relationship seems to be eroding, and how what that means for our responsibility to move that along, to stop the carnage and bloodshed as soon as we possibly can. And so, wrapping up with events and actions, I mentioned last week that there's going to be a fundraiser for AROC Action this week. It is tomorrow. I'm unfortunately out of town, but I hope you all can make it at BSAP Baobab. I think you need tickets, so do check out the website. If you want to know about other events, please check out our calendar at bit.ly/Gaza events. If you want text updates, please text PSA to 833-633-0604. And if you want any more information about the articles that inform this analysis, you can always check out the PAL Media Tracker. You can sign up at palmediatracker.com/sign up. And that's it.
Sammer, thanks so much. So much to keep track of on all fronts.
My brain hurts.
Yeah, and as we mentioned at the start, there's both, as Samar was mentioned, there's both a lot of California-based kind of work going on at the legislative level, and then also, there's these individual cases which people are keeping track of, and also we didn't touch upon it in much depth today, but a lot happening with student organizing on various campuses around the Bay Area. So I think the AROC calendar has been a good place to keep up with what's going on. Um, and yeah, I think we're having a request, Sammer, to reshare the upcoming events and action slide. So
Yeah, let me find it. Sorry, I'm gonna need a
yeah, no
second.
worries.
And while I'm pulling it up, it's worth noting, and thank you, Dylan, for pointing it out. I was gonna say it, and then I got distracted by my microphone not working. There is a lobby day being organized by CARE on the 14th, where they're busing folks. I think they're busing folks. There will definitely be some way that people will coordinate to get you to Sacramento to meet with your state legislative officials, and it's really critical. Like, I cannot overstate what an important moment it is to do that. So if you are around and have the ability, I think it's a Thursday. Please do consider doing that.
Yeah, and then also to the point about the AROC fundraiser tomorrow, it's AROC and Mecca that
Mm-hmm.
are the funds are being raised for, and as we mentioned at the top, that the situation of famine is quite serious. It's been serious, but it's quite serious, and there's a bunch of other articles in addition to what Sam shared that are coming out today and yesterday and this week, just talking about the seriousness of the situation and its impact on families and children. And so, what we can do to support organizations like Mecca is always appreciated. And we'll be back next week. Sam, I don't know if you have the slides ready so I can
Yeah,
reshare.
it should be up, I think, if you.
Okay, let me go back to that.
And just to say, the hearing on that ethnic studies bill is that same day. It's on the 14th. So that doubly makes it really important to be there that day if you can. If you want to find out more information, you can text Lobby Day to that same phone number, and I'll make sure that you get some information on it. Otherwise, just look out for, I think, CARE and AROC are putting out information. Well, CARE and AROC Action are putting out information about it.
Great. Thanks all for joining. We'll be back next week, and stay tuned to the events calendar, and we'll see you then.